The morning of April 18, 1942, dawned over Tokyo with the quiet rhythm of ordinary life. Merchants were sliding open the doors to their shops, preparing for another day of commerce under the assumption of absolute security. Children made their way to school, their chatter filling the streets as the capital city stirred. In this atmosphere of profound peace, no one suspected that in just a few minutes, the sky would be filled with the deep, unfamiliar roar of American engines. For the Japanese people, the home islands were a sanctuary, a fortress protected by an unwavering belief in their own invulnerability. This conviction was deeply rooted in both geography and military pride. The vast Pacific Ocean was perceived as more than just a body of water, it was an insurmountable shield, a natural barrier that no enemy could ever breach. The Imperial Japanese Navy was the nation's invincible sword, a force that had guaranteed the sanctity of their homeland for generations. The idea that an enemy could strike the heart of the empire was not just a strategic improbability, it was a psychological impossibility. Then, at that precise moment, as the strange aircraft appeared low in the sky, the unthinkable became reality. The first bombs fell to the ground, and with their deafening explosions, the myth of an impenetrable Japan crumbled. The shockwave that ripped through the city was both physical and psychological. As windows shattered and fires erupted, the shield was pierced and the sword was proven fallible. The roar of unknown engines overhead was the sound of a sacred belief being annihilated. In those few minutes, the war, once a distant concept fought on foreign shores, had arrived in Tokyo, and the impossible had violently announced its arrival. In the cold, grim weeks that followed the devastating attack on Pearl Harbor, a palpable sense of defeat and vulnerability hung over the United States. The nation was reeling, its Pacific Fleet crippled and its spirit shaken. In Washington, D.C., the pressure to retaliate was immense, and no one felt it more acutely than President Franklin D. Roosevelt. At his daily briefings, amidst reports of further Japanese advances across the Pacific, the president posed the same relentless question to his military chiefs: how could America strike back at Japan? It was more than a request for a military plan, it was a demand for a symbol of hope, a sign that the United States was not broken and that the war could be taken directly to the enemy's homeland. The challenge, however, seemed insurmountable. Japan was thousands of miles away, protected by the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean and its powerful navy. A conventional attack appeared to be an impossibility. The answer would not come from a high-level strategic planning committee, but from a flash of inspiration in the mind of a single naval officer who wasn't even an aviator. On January 10, 1942, Captain Francis S. Lowe of the U.S. Navy was in Norfolk, Virginia, on a routine assignment. His purpose was to conduct an inspection of the newly commissioned aircraft carrier, the USS Hornet. As his aircraft descended towards the naval base, he gazed down at the flurry of activity on the airfields below. What he saw was a juxtaposition of two seemingly unrelated training exercises. On one of the runways, naval personnel had painted the precise outline of an aircraft carrier's flight deck, a common tool used to help naval pilots practice their notoriously difficult carrier landings. Near this painted deck, a group of U.S. Army twin-engine bombers were conducting their own drills, practicing takeoffs and simulated bombing runs. For anyone else, especially a seasoned naval aviator, the two scenes would have represented different worlds, the Navy's domain of the sea and the Army's domain of the land. But Captain Lowe was a specialist in submarine warfare, not aviation. It was this very lack of preconceived notions, this fresh perspective, that allowed him to see what others could not. As he watched the Army bombers thunder down their runways, a bold and audacious idea instantly ignited in his mind: what if? What if it were possible to launch those twin-engine Army bombers, with their superior range and bomb capacity compared to carrier planes, not from a land-based runway, but from the deck of an aircraft carrier at sea? The concept was radical, defying all conventional military doctrine. Army bombers were large, heavy aircraft designed for the stability and length of solid ground. Aircraft carriers were floating, pitching platforms built for smaller, lighter, specially designed naval aircraft. The idea of combining the two seemed technically absurd. Yet, the logic was undeniable. If it could be done, it would solve the problem of range, allowing the bombers to get close enough to strike Japan before flying on to friendly territory in Asia. It was the only conceivable way to bridge the immense distance of the Pacific and answer the president's call for action. Understanding the potential significance of his idea, Captain Lowe did not dismiss it as a fleeting fantasy. He took his revolutionary concept to his superior, Admiral Ernest J. King, the formidable chief of naval operations. King was known for his demanding nature and sharp intellect, and he listened intently. Where another commander might have dismissed the idea as reckless and impractical, King recognized the kernel of strategic genius within Lowe's proposal. He treated the idea with the seriousness it deserved. Recognizing that such an operation would require unprecedented cooperation between the armed forces, Admiral King immediately contacted his counterpart in the U.S. Army Air Forces, General Henry "Hap" Arnold. He relayed the unorthodox proposal from the submariner who dared to imagine the impossible. With that conversation, the seed of the Doolittle Raid was planted. An idea born from a chance observation in the skies over Norfolk had now reached the highest echelons of the U.S. military, setting in motion a plan that would forever change the course of the war in the Pacific. With the audacious concept now approved at the highest levels, the mission transitioned from a theoretical idea into a daunting technical puzzle. The central question was a matter of pure physics and engineering: which American bomber, if any, possessed the unique combination of size, weight, and performance characteristics to successfully take off from the short, moving deck of an aircraft carrier. Planners immediately began a rigorous technical analysis of the available medium bombers in the U.S. Army Air Force's arsenal. The criteria were unforgiving. The aircraft had to be small enough to fit on a carrier's flight deck and light enough to lift off in a fraction of the distance it normally required, yet powerful enough to carry a meaningful bomb load over thousands of miles. Several candidates were considered, but quickly dismissed. The B-26 Marauder, a fast and modern bomber, was rejected due to its challenging flight characteristics, particularly its high landing speed and demanding takeoff profile, which were deemed entirely unsuitable for a carrier launch. Another option, the B-23 Dragon, was disqualified for a simpler but equally insurmountable reason: its wingspan was far too wide to be safely maneuvered on the constrained space of an aircraft carrier's deck. After eliminating the alternatives, the planners focused on one aircraft that seemed to hold a glimmer of possibility: the North American B-25 Mitchell. It was a rugged, reliable twin-engine bomber, and while it was never designed for naval operations, its specifications suggested it might just be capable of achieving the impossible. But theory was not enough. To turn this high-stakes gamble into a viable military operation, the concept had to be proven in the real world. On February 2, 1942, a historic and clandestine test was arranged off the coast of Norfolk, Virginia, aboard the same vessel that had inspired the mission, the USS Hornet. Two B-25s were carefully hoisted by crane from the pier onto the carrier's flight deck, their massive frames looking utterly out of place on the wooden planking designed for much smaller naval aircraft. The success or failure of the entire mission hinged on what would happen next. At 1:27 p.m., Lieutenant John Fitzgerald pushed the throttles of his B-25 forward. The engines roared to life, and the bomber surged down the deck, lifting successfully into the air. The first hurdle was cleared. Soon after, Lieutenant James McCarthy prepared for his attempt. In a stunning feat of airmanship, McCarthy's bomber became airborne after using just 275 feet of the flight deck, a fraction of its normal takeoff roll. The test was an unequivocal success. It proved, against all conventional wisdom, that an Army medium bomber could indeed be launched from a carrier. The tension of the trials was punctuated by a moment of high drama and eventual comedy. During the test, the Hornet's general quarters alarm suddenly blared across the ship. Observers had spotted what appeared to be the periscope of an enemy submarine. The crew sprang into action, launching an immediate attack on the suspected target. An oil slick soon appeared on the surface of the water, seemingly confirming a successful hit. However, the periscope remained stubbornly in place. A subsequent investigation revealed the embarrassing truth: the crew had been attacking the mast of a merchant vessel that had been sunk in the area months earlier. With the aircraft selected and the takeoff concept validated, the final crucial piece of the puzzle was finding the right person to lead this incredibly dangerous and unorthodox mission. The choice fell to one of the most famous and respected figures in aviation, Lieutenant Colonel James "Jimmy" Doolittle. He was more than just a pilot, he was a legend. A pioneering test pilot, air racer, and aeronautical engineer, Doolittle had spent his career pushing the absolute limits of aviation technology and human endurance. He possessed the perfect blend of technical expertise, audacious courage, and unwavering leadership required for an operation where there was no margin for error. When offered command, Doolittle accepted, but with a single, non-negotiable condition that underscored the immense authority he would need: "Everything I ask for, I will get." The promise was made, and the mission now had its commander. The North American B-25 Mitchell was a capable medium bomber, but the aircraft that rolled off the factory assembly line was wholly unprepared for the unprecedented mission it was about to undertake. To transform it into an instrument capable of a long-range strike launched from a carrier, each of the selected bombers had to undergo a series of radical and highly secret modifications. The goal was twofold: drastically increase its range and strip it of every ounce of non-essential weight, all while adapting it for a unique, low-altitude attack profile. The process began with a ruthless campaign of subtraction. The remote-controlled ventral, lower, gun turret, a standard defensive feature of the B-25, was one of the first components to be removed. It was considered largely ineffective at the extremely low altitudes the mission would require and, more importantly, its removal shed hundreds of pounds of precious weight. To prepare the aircraft for the long, cold flight over the open ocean, new de-icing systems were installed on the wings and tail surfaces. For the protection of the aircrew, steel blast plates were fitted around the upper turret position to shield the gunner from potential enemy fire. In one of the most significant weight-saving measures, the heavy liaison radio equipment was completely dismantled and removed. The mission profile called for strict radio silence, making the bulky equipment dead weight that the bombers simply could not afford to carry. However, the most critical challenge was fuel. A standard B-25 did not have nearly enough range to fly from a launch point in the Pacific, strike Japan, and continue on to safe airfields in China. The solution was a series of ingenious fuel system modifications that nearly doubled the bomber's capacity, increasing it from a standard 646 gallons to a staggering 1,141 gallons. This remarkable feat was achieved by installing a custom-built, collapsible neoprene fuel tank directly in the upper portion of the bomb bay, effectively turning part of the weapons area into a giant fuel reservoir. Additional fuel cells were squeezed into the narrow crawlway above the bomb bay and into the empty space once occupied by the lower turret. This massive increase in fuel came at the cost of bomb capacity, but it was the only way to give the raiders a chance of reaching their destinations. The modifications were not all about complex engineering, some were exercises in clever, low-tech deception. In the tail of each bomber, the real machine guns were replaced with a pair of broomsticks, sawed off and painted black to resemble gun barrels. It was a simple psychological trick, a ruse intended to make any pursuing Japanese fighter pilot think twice before attacking from the rear, a sector now left completely undefended. Perhaps the most remarkable innovation involved the bombing system itself. The bombers were stripped of their top-secret Norden bombsight, a sophisticated and expensive piece of technology that cost the government $10,000 per unit. While revolutionary for high-altitude precision bombing, the Norden was less effective for the low-level attack profile planned for the raid. In its place, crews would use a simple but far more suitable device nicknamed the Mark Twain. Developed by one of the mission's own pilots, Captain C. Ross Greening, this improvised sight was fashioned from a few pieces of aluminum and cost a mere 20 cents to produce. For the specific task of dropping bombs from a few hundred feet, it was more accurate than its far more complex predecessor. By the time the modifications were complete, these were no longer standard B-25s, they were highly specialized, stripped-down weapons, custom-built for a one-way mission into history. With the aircraft undergoing their radical transformations, the chosen aircrews needed to be forged into a unit capable of executing the mission. Between February 27 and March 3, 24 B-25 crews were ordered to a remote, secluded base, Eglin Field in the Florida Panhandle. Its proximity to the Gulf of Mexico made it the ideal location for the specialized training required, allowing pilots to practice low-level navigation and bombing runs over open water, simulating the conditions they would face on their way to Japan. On March 3, the crews assembled to meet their commander for the first time. Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle stood before them and was brutally honest. He made no attempt to downplay the risks, stating plainly that the mission they were embarking upon would be exceedingly dangerous. He stressed that participation was strictly voluntary and that any man could withdraw at that very moment, for any reason, with no questions asked and no negative mark on his record. He looked out at the faces of the young airmen, giving them the chance to walk away from what could very well be a suicide mission. Not a single man left the room. The most critical skill the Army pilots had to master was the carrier takeoff, a maneuver for which they had absolutely no training. To teach them, the Navy sent one of its best, Lieutenant Henry Hank Miller, a flight instructor from Pensacola. When Miller arrived at Eglin, however, the Army aviators were immediately skeptical. A significant problem became apparent. Miller, the expert tasked with teaching them how to launch a B-25 from a carrier, had never once laid eyes on a B-25 bomber in his life. The skepticism in the air was thick. How could this naval pilot, unfamiliar with their aircraft, possibly teach them a technique that most considered technically impossible? Miller wasted no time in proving them wrong. He climbed into the co-pilot seat of a B-25, with Captain Edward Ski York, one of the most experienced Army pilots, at the controls. Ignoring the Army's standard procedure for a high-speed takeoff, Miller calmly instructed York to follow the standard naval technique, which relied on the aircraft's lift and the carrier's speed, not raw runway velocity. The Army pilots were accustomed to taking off at around 110 miles per hour. Miller was instructing them to aim for a speed of just 65 to 70 miles per hour, with the plane's nose high in the air. Following Miller's directions, York's B-25 lifted off the runway with astonishing ease, using half the normal speed and a fraction of the distance. In that single, masterful demonstration, Hank Miller earned the unwavering respect of every man on the base. The training that followed was relentless and unforgiving. Pilots practiced short field takeoffs over and over, marking out a 450-foot stretch of runway to simulate the limited space of a carrier deck, a stark contrast to the 700-plus feet they were used to. They honed their skills in low-altitude bombing, navigation over water, and gunnery. Their practice runs became a little too realistic for the locals, as the crews would conduct mock bombing raids on cities along the Florida coast, prompting a flood of complaints to the Eglin base commander from alarmed residents. The inherent danger of their training was ever present. On March 23, the risk became a tragic reality when an aircraft flown by Lieutenant James Bates stalled and crashed immediately after takeoff from Auxiliary Airdrome No. 3, which would later be named Duke Field. Bates was subsequently removed from the mission. For the remaining crews, the accident was a grim reminder of the stakes involved and the razor-thin margin for error they would face. To understand the shock of April 18, 1942, it is critical to first understand the mindset of the Japanese military command, a mindset built on a foundation of supreme self-confidence and a series of seemingly logical assumptions that rendered an American air raid on Tokyo utterly impossible. This strategic blindness was not born of ignorance, but of a rigid adherence to established military doctrine and a fatal miscalculation of their enemy's ingenuity and resolve. First and foremost, the Japanese leadership based their defense on the known capabilities of their adversaries' hardware. They knew that no American carrier-based aircraft possessed the operational range to strike the Japanese mainland and return to its ship. The distance was simply too great. A carrier task force would have to venture dangerously close to Japanese shores to launch such an attack, exposing it to the full might of the Imperial Navy and land-based air forces. From their perspective, such a move would be suicidal, and therefore, was not a threat to be taken seriously. Second, the very concept of launching medium bombers, such as the B-25, from an aircraft carrier was dismissed as technically unfeasible. Japanese and, indeed, most Allied military planners considered it a fundamental rule of aviation that such large, heavy, land-based aircraft could not be operated from the short, unstable deck of a ship at sea. It was a feat that had never been attempted and was believed to be beyond the realm of practical application. The idea was so outlandish that it was not even considered a remote possibility in their strategic assessments. Third, Japan had invested in what it believed was a foolproof early warning system. A picket line of approximately 50 patrol boats was stationed in a wide arc, positioned between 700 and 800 miles off the Japanese coast. This naval screen was designed specifically to detect any approaching enemy surface fleet long before it could get within striking distance of the home islands. Japanese commanders were confident that this layered defense would provide ample warning to intercept and destroy any hostile force that dared to venture so close. Fourth, this sense of security had created a glaring vulnerability in their defensive posture. The air defense systems protecting Japan were not prepared for the type of attack the Doolittle Raid would represent. There were no training scenarios, no contingency plans, and no tactical protocols for intercepting an attack by medium bombers approaching from the sea. Their entire defensive strategy was oriented towards repelling naval aircraft or high-altitude bombers flying from established land bases, neither of which seemed a plausible threat in early 1942. Underpinning these technical and strategic assumptions was a profound psychological miscalculation. Japanese military analysts, buoyed by their string of stunning victories since Pearl Harbor, believed that American morale was shattered. They interpreted the lack of a significant American counterattack as proof that the United States was too demoralized, too disorganized, and too psychologically defeated to mount a daring, innovative, and high-risk operation. This fatal underestimation of their opponent's will to fight became the cornerstone of their strategic error, creating a blind spot so large that 16 American bombers would fly right through it. The final, secretive phase of preparation began on March 31, when the USS Hornet slipped through the waters of San Francisco Bay and moored at the bustling Alameda Naval Air Station in California. The sight of the massive aircraft carrier, preparing for its maiden combat voyage, was a clear signal that the mission was entering its most critical stage. That same day, the specially modified B-25 bombers made their short flight from their final staging point in Sacramento to Alameda, their engines thundering over the bay as they landed for the last time on solid ground. Over the next 24 hours, a delicate and unprecedented operation unfolded on the pier. One by one, 16 massive B-25 bombers were carefully hoisted by crane from the airfield and lowered onto the carrier's flight deck, a process watched with a mixture of awe and apprehension. The Army aircraft, with their wide wingspans and heavy frames, looked utterly alien on the wooden deck of a naval vessel. Each bomber was meticulously positioned and then securely lashed down in the precise order of its planned takeoff, a critical arrangement that left no room for error once the launch sequence began. The Army bombers were so large that they completely consumed the flight deck. The Hornet's own complement of fighter planes and dive bombers had to be stowed away on the hangar deck below, as the B-25s were too immense to fit on the ship's elevators. This logistical reality underscored the unique nature of the mission. The carrier had been transformed into a floating launch pad, dedicated to a single, one-way purpose. Its own aerial fighting capacity was sealed away, a clear sign that its primary role was not to fight, but to deliver its Army passengers to their launch point. This period of intense preparation was marked by a little-known detail that highlighted the immense pressure and caution of the leadership. The Hornet's commander, Captain Mark Mitcher, was unwilling to risk maneuvering the 19,800-ton vessel with an untested crew through the treacherous, fog-shrouded bay at night. He made an extraordinary decision. He halted the carrier in the middle of San Francisco Bay, anchoring the ship and its top-secret cargo until the safety of daylight. The moment of departure came on the morning of April 2. At precisely 10:18 a.m., the Hornet's anchors were weighed, and the great ship, laden with its strange cargo of Army bombers, passed under the Golden Gate Bridge and out into the vast expanse of the Pacific. It was the carrier's first-ever combat mission, a historic sortie into the unknown. The secrecy surrounding their point of departure would later give rise to one of the most famous anecdotes of the war. When pressed by journalists about the bomber's origin, President Franklin D. Roosevelt would answer with a wry smile, "They flew from our new secret base at Shangri-La." The name, borrowed from the fictional, Hidden Paradise in the novel, Lost Horizon - perfectly captured the mission's mystique and cemented its legendary status in the public imagination. For nearly 2 weeks, the USS Hornet and its escorting warships steamed westward across the vast, empty Pacific. For the 80 Army airmen living aboard the carrier, it was a period of intense anticipation and speculation. They knew their mission was of monumental importance, but its ultimate destination remained a closely guarded secret. On April 13, the solitary journey ended as the Hornet Task Force rendezvoused with a formidable fleet under the command of Admiral William Bull Halsey. This was Task Force 16, centered on the battle-hardened aircraft carrier USS Enterprise - which would now provide a powerful combat air patrol and escort for the final, most dangerous leg of the journey. It was only then, shielded by the full might of Halsey's force, that the secret was finally revealed to the Army crews. Gathered together, they learned their objective, Tokyo. The news sent a shockwave of emotion through the fleet. For the Navy sailors on the Hornet and Enterprise - who had been itching for a chance to strike back after Pearl Harbor, the reaction was one of pure envy. The Army men, however, erupted in a jubilant uproar. This was the moment they had been training for, the chance to take the war directly to the heart of the Japanese Empire. Sensing the gravity of the announcement, Jimmy Doolittle once again addressed his men. He asked if anyone, now knowing the extreme danger of striking the enemy's capital, wished to back out. The response was unanimous and unwavering, not a single man stepped forward. The morale was so high, in fact, that some of the reserve crew members who were not assigned to the primary 16 aircraft desperately tried to buy their way onto the mission, offering up to $150, a significant sum at the time, to trade places with a designated raider. Their offers were all refused. On April 17, the combined task force reached its final crucial waypoint, approximately 1,000 miles from the coast of Japan. The ships conducted a final, risky refueling at sea, topping off their tanks for the high-speed approach and subsequent escape. The grim determination of the men was mixed with powerful moments of symbolic defiance. Several officers who, in the years of peace before the war, had been decorated by the Japanese government, now retrieved those medals. They attached them to the 500-pound bombs destined for Tokyo. Admiral Halsey himself took part in this ritual, strapping his own Japanese medal to a bomb and giving the airmen a simple, clear instruction: "Boys, return these medals with interest." But as the task force steamed into the final stretch, a tragic irony, unknown to Doolittle or any of his men, was already sealing their fate. The entire plan depended on landing at designated airfields in friendly areas of China after the raid. However, a critical failure in communication meant that their Chinese allies had not been fully informed about the specific nature or timing of the mission. Compounding the problem, a severe weather front was moving in over the Chinese coast. Believing a Japanese offensive was imminent, the Chinese forces maintained strict radio silence to prepare, leaving the incoming American raiders with no way to home in on the unprepared airfields. They were flying toward a phantom sanctuary. The final approach was a nerve-wracking dash through hostile waters, a high-stakes gamble where success depended entirely on remaining undetected. In the pre-dawn darkness of April 18, that gamble began to unravel. At 3:10 a.m., the radar on the USS Enterprise picked up two contacts, Japanese ships, just 11 miles ahead. Admiral Halsey immediately ordered a course change, and the American task force slipped past them in the dark, narrowly avoiding detection. The crisis seemed to have been averted. A short time later, at 5:58 a.m., a patrol aircraft from the Enterprise spotted another Japanese vessel 40 miles ahead of the fleet. Once again, Halsey altered course, and once again, the task force successfully evaded the enemy picket. For a few more precious hours, their luck held. But that luck ran out at 7:38 a.m. Lookouts on the USS Hornet made a sudden, chilling visual contact. The Japanese patrol boat, Nito Maru No. 23, had appeared out of the morning haze, dangerously close at a range of about 10 miles. There was no longer any possibility of stealth. The American cruiser USS Nashville immediately opened fire with its powerful 6-inch guns, the shells splashing in the water around the small vessel. At the same time, dive bombers from the Enterprise screamed down from the sky, joining the attack to ensure the Japanese boat was silenced quickly. The Nito Maru was fatally hit and sank beneath the waves at 8:23 a.m., but the damage was already done. Before it went down, its radio operator had managed to transmit a frantic, uncoded warning message: 3 enemy aircraft carriers sighted. Position 600 nautical miles east of Inubosaki. On the bridge of the Enterprise American radio operators intercepted the signal, listening as the Japanese transmissions continued for a full 27 minutes after the first shots were fired. They knew with absolute certainty that their presence had been reported to the Japanese mainland. The element of surprise, the cornerstone of the entire mission, was now compromised, if not completely lost. Admiral Halsey was faced with a stark and momentous decision. The task force was still approximately 700 miles from Tokyo, a full 150 miles farther out than the planned launch point. It was also 10 hours earlier than scheduled. To launch now meant the B-25s would be stretched to the absolute limit of their fuel reserves, with virtually no margin for error. To continue steaming forward, however, meant sailing directly into the teeth of the alerted Japanese Navy and Air Forces, risking the loss of 2 precious American aircraft carriers. The choice was clear, if agonizing. Halsey flashed the signal to the Hornet launch planes. To call Doolittle and his gallant command, "Good luck and God bless you." The raid was on, ahead of schedule and into a storm of uncertainty. The order to launch transformed the deck of the USS Hornet into a scene of organized chaos set against a backdrop of nature's fury. The weather was atrocious. A cold, driving rain lashed the ship, and fierce wind gusts of 20 knots whipped across the flight deck. The carrier itself was battling enormous ocean swells, pitching and rolling violently in the turbulent sea. Massive waves crashed over the bow, sending sheets of green and white water cascading down the very runway the bombers were meant to use. It was under these treacherous conditions that the Army pilots had to perform a maneuver that not a single one of them, including their experienced leader Jimmy Doolittle, had ever executed before, a real takeoff from an aircraft carrier. At 8:20 a.m., Doolittle's B-25, perched at the very front of the deck, roared to life. He had the shortest takeoff run of all, a dangerously small margin for error on a heaving deck. The deck crew timed the launch with practiced precision, signaling him to go at the exact moment the ship's bow crested a wave and reached its highest point, a crucial technique designed to give the heavy bomber a precious extra bit of upward lift. With a thunderous roar, Doolittle's plane surged forward, sped down the short path, and miraculously lifted into the stormy sky. The first plane was away. One by one, the other 15 bombers followed. As each aircraft moved into position, it gained a little more deck space than the one before it, but even for those further back, the available runway was terrifyingly short, less than 250 feet for some. The crews performed the complex sequence with remarkable speed and courage. The average interval between each launch was less than 4 minutes, an incredible pace given the violent conditions. Each pilot skillfully replicated the technique, pushing their engines to full power and timing their release to the rhythm of the rising sea. At 9:19 a.m., the 16th and final B-25 cleared the deck and climbed into the gray, overcast sky. In a stunning display of airmanship and nerve, every single one of the 16 bombers had launched safely. The entire operation, from the first takeoff to the last, had taken just under 1 hour. The moment the last bomber was airborne, the mission of the Naval Task Force was complete. Without a second's delay, the fleet executed a sharp 90-degree turn and, pushing its engines to a flank speed of 25 knots, began its high-speed retreat eastward, leaving the raiders to fly on alone toward Japan. After lifting off from the storm-tossed deck of the Hornet the 16 B-25s descended to wave-top level, skimming just feet above the churning Pacific. This low-altitude approach was their only defense, a desperate tactic to fly under Japanese radar and avoid visual detection by patrol planes or ships. For hours, they flew onward, navigating by dead reckoning, a challenging method of calculation based on their course, speed, and time. There were no radio beacons or friendly landmarks to guide them over the vast, featureless expanse of the ocean. Around noon, they began to arrive over the Japanese coastline. The impossible had happened. In Tokyo, the rhythm of a Saturday midday was shattered by an unfamiliar sound, the deep, guttural roar of twin-engine aircraft. It was a sound wholly different from the hum of the Japanese planes that citizens were used to. On the streets below, people stopped in their tracks, their conversations ceasing as their faces turned upward. The silhouettes they saw against the clouds were alien, menacing. For the first time in its long history, the capital of Japan was under attack by enemy bombers. The psychological shock was immediate and profound. As the B-25s thundered over the city, bombs began to fall. The raiders targeted military installations and key industrial areas, but some bombs fell near the sacred ground of the imperial palace. The city shuddered with the force of the explosions. Windows blew out, sending shards of glass flying through the air. Fires erupted, spewing black smoke into the sky. The screams of terrified citizens mingled with the sound of destruction. The myth of an invulnerable homeland, a sanctuary protected by divine will and military might, was being blown apart. Japan's air defenses, caught completely by surprise, mounted a feeble and ineffective response. Anti-aircraft batteries fired sporadically, but their aim was poor. Only one of the 16 B-25s sustained any damage, and it was minor. The attack was swift and brutally efficient. 12 of the bombers dropped their payloads on Tokyo, while the remaining 4 struck other strategic cities, including Yokohama, Kobe, Osaka, and Nagoya. Every bomb found a target. In a matter of minutes, the raiders had come and gone, leaving behind a trail of physical destruction and a deep, psychological wound. The myth of Japan's invincibility lay shattered in the rubble and broken glass of its capital. Once the bombs were away and the Japanese coast receded behind them, the mission entered its second, equally perilous phase, survival. 15 of the 16 B-25s banked southwest, flying along the southern coast of Japan before heading out across the stormy East China Sea. Their destination was a network of friendly airfields in eastern China, a sanctuary they would never reach. The 16th aircraft, critically low on fuel after the unexpectedly early launch, had no chance of making it to China and set a desperate course for the nearest alternative, the Soviet Union. The journey ended in chaos and tragedy. As fuel ran out over mainland China in the dark of night and terrible weather, the crews were forced to either bail out into the unknown or attempt crash landings on treacherous terrain. The immediate human cost was high. 2 men drowned when their aircraft ditched in the water, and another died when his parachute failed to deploy properly. For most, however, the ordeal was just beginning. A far darker fate awaited 8 of the raiders who were captured by Japanese forces in China. They were subjected to a sham show trial, where they were accused of war crimes for the murder of civilians. On October 15, 1942, 3 of the men, pilots William Farrow and Dean Hallmark, and gunner Harold Spatz, were executed by firing squad. A 4th, Lieutenant Robert Meader, succumbed to the brutal conditions of his imprisonment, dying of malnutrition and exhaustion in a POW camp on December 1, 1943. The remaining 4 captured airmen endured an unimaginable 40 months in Japanese captivity. They were subjected to systematic torture, prolonged periods of solitary confinement, and near starvation, but miraculously survived to be liberated in August 1945. The crew that had diverted to the Soviet Union landed their B-25 safely at an airfield near Vladivostok. However, because the USSR was not yet at war with Japan, the American airmen were promptly interned under international law. They would spend over a year in detention before managing to escape through the Middle East, a departure quietly facilitated by Soviet authorities. The final, and largest, group consisted of the 64 men who successfully evaded capture after bailing out or crash landing in China. Their survival was owed entirely to the courage and compassion of strangers. They were found, hidden, and guided to safety by a network of Chinese civilians, local partisan fighters, and foreign missionaries who risked their own lives to shelter the Americans from searching Japanese patrols. These 64 men, after incredible hardship, eventually made their way to a zone of safety, completing their long and harrowing journey from the deck of the USS Hornet. The Doolittle Raid had struck a blow to Japan's pride, but its darkest and most tragic consequence was not felt in Tokyo, but in the provinces of eastern China. The humiliation of the raid quickly curdled into incandescent rage when the Japanese High Command learned that Chinese civilians had actively aided and sheltered the American airmen. In late April, the Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo issued a direct order to the 13th Army, supported by elements of the 11th and North China Armies, to carry out a punitive operation. This directive unleashed the Zhejiang-Jiangxi campaign, a brutal and systematic operation of vengeance. The operation had 2 savage objectives: first, to systematically destroy any Chinese airfields that could potentially be used by American bombers in the future, and second, to inflict a merciless punishment upon the local population who had dared to help the enemy. What followed was a campaign of terror that is difficult to fully comprehend. By some estimates, as many as 250,000 Chinese civilians were slaughtered in the provinces of Zhejiang and Jiangxi, the very areas where Doolittle's men had landed. It was a massacre on a scale comparable to the infamous rape of Nanking in 1937–38, as Japanese troops went on a rampage of looting, torture, and murder. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of this tragedy is a little-known fact: American military authorities were aware that a raid on Tokyo would likely provoke a savage retaliatory attack on Free China. Despite this foreknowledge, they proceeded with the operation. Furthermore, they made the calculated decision to keep the mission a secret even from their Pacific allies. Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek, the leader of nationalist China, was deliberately not informed of the raid's details. American planners feared, correctly, that he would have certainly refused to cooperate if he had known, anticipating the horrific price his people would pay in the inevitable Japanese reprisal. The Doolittle Raid was a stunning American victory, but its hidden cost was paid in the blood of their Chinese allies. In purely military terms, the physical damage inflicted by the Doolittle Raid was minimal. A handful of bombs dropped by 16 small bombers did little to cripple Japan's vast industrial and military machine. The true impact of the raid, however, was not measured in tons of steel, but in the seismic shift it created in the psychology of both warring nations. For the American public, reeling from a relentless series of defeats since Pearl Harbor, the news that their bombers had struck Tokyo was a powerful and desperately needed jolt to national morale. It was a symbol of resilience, a clear message that the United States was still in the fight and was capable of taking the war directly to the enemy's doorstep. For the Japanese people and their military leadership, the psychological blow was just as profound, but in the opposite direction. The raid shattered the deeply held myth of an invulnerable homeland, replacing a feeling of supreme security with a new and unsettling sense of vulnerability. For the High Command, the attack was a source of immense humiliation. Their defenses had been breached, their capital attacked, and their enemy had proven far more resourceful and daring than they had ever imagined. This sense of shame had immediate and catastrophic strategic consequences. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, seized upon the raid as the ultimate justification for his ambitious plan to seek out and destroy America's remaining aircraft carriers. He forcefully argued that the carriers represented a direct threat to the emperor and the homeland, and that they must be eliminated at all costs. The Doolittle Raid, which took place on April 18, became the critical catalyst that silenced any remaining opposition to his plan, Operation MI. This led directly to a critical strategic error. Goaded by the sting of the raid, the Japanese Imperial Navy accelerated its timeline for a decisive confrontation, leading them into the Battle of Midway, which took place from June 4 to 7, 1942. In their haste to force a battle and eliminate the American carrier threat, they overextended their forces and sailed into a well-laid American trap. The resulting defeat was catastrophic. Japan lost 4 of its finest aircraft carriers, the core of its naval power, and with them, its offensive initiative in the Pacific War. In a profound paradox, the bold American raid, designed as a retaliatory gesture, provoked a rash and emotional response from the Japanese command that hurried them toward their ultimate downfall. Furthermore, in the immediate aftermath of the raid, Japan was forced to pull significant air and naval assets back from its offensive operations across the Pacific to bolster the defense of the home islands, further weakening its strategic position. The Doolittle Raid, while tactically minor, had set in motion the chain of events that would turn the tide of the war. In the chaotic aftermath of the raid, Jimmy Doolittle parachuted from his crippled bomber into the darkness over China. His fall was broken by a soft landing in a pile of manure, a stroke of luck that likely saved him from a broken ankle. Despite his survival, Doolittle was consumed by a sense of failure. He believed the mission was a complete disaster because all 16 of his aircraft had been lost. When he finally reconnected with his men, he was convinced he would face a court-martial for losing his entire command. The reality, however, was dramatically different. Instead of a tribunal, Doolittle was met with a hero's welcome. In a move that stunned the military establishment, he was promoted directly from lieutenant colonel to brigadier general, skipping the rank of colonel entirely. Soon after, he was summoned to the White House, where President Roosevelt awarded him the nation's highest military decoration, the Medal of Honor. The Navy flight instructor who had taught his Army pilots the impossible, Lieutenant Henry Miller, was also recognized for his crucial contribution, receiving the Legion of Merit. The legacy of the 80 men who flew the mission endured for decades, embodied by the last of their number. Richard "Dick" Cole, Doolittle's own co-pilot on the lead aircraft, lived to be 103 years old, passing away on April 9, 2019. With his death, the final chapter of the Doolittle Raiders' living history came to a close. The raid quickly became an iconic story of American courage, immortalized in popular culture. The 1943 book 30 Seconds Over Tokyo written by Captain Ted W. Lawson, one of the raid's pilots, became an instant bestseller. It was adapted into a celebrated 1944 MGM film of the same name, which won an Academy Award and remains a classic of the war genre, cementing the raiders' daring feat in the national consciousness. For the survivors, the bond forged in the skies over the Pacific never faded. They gathered annually for solemn reunions, honoring their fallen comrades with a poignant ritual known as the final toast. At each gathering, they would raise a glass to the men who had passed away since their last meeting. This solemn tradition continued for decades, a powerful symbol of their shared experience, finally concluding with the passing of the last of these extraordinary heroes. The Doolittle Raid stands as a powerful and enduring lesson in military history. Overconfidence is the worst possible enemy. The Japanese military command, utterly convinced of the technical impossibility of such an attack, failed to even imagine a scenario in which the Americans would find a way to achieve the impossible. Their strategic vision was blinded by their own assumptions. In contrast, the raid was a stunning demonstration of the power of American innovation, seamless inter-service cooperation between the Army and the Navy, and unwavering determination in the face of insurmountable odds. For Japan, the attack shattered the nation's sense of invulnerability and served as a chilling omen of the massive strategic bombing raids that would, in the years to come, lead the nation to its final capitulation in August 1945. The historical significance of the mission was perhaps best captured by Admiral William "Bull" Halsey, who signaled to Doolittle's men, "I know of no more gallant deed in history than that performed by your squadron. You have made history." Ultimately, the Doolittle Raid became a timeless symbol of the principle that even in the darkest and most desperate moments of a war, boundless courage and human ingenuity can fundamentally change the course of history.